What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the final matchups show of the season. Bittersweet to say it, but at least my Eagles are in the Super Bowl. Joined this week, very special guest, Sam McDowell from the Kansas City Star. How are you doing, man?
I'm exhausted. I'm out here in New Orleans, and this is, as grateful as you are to cover another Super Bowl, the fifth one in 6 years. It's an exhausting week, so I am extremely ready for Sunday.
I believe that without question. I'm also extremely ready for Sunday because I want to get rid of this just like anxious energy for my Eagles. I just want to be able to watch the game, know what happens.
Yeah, sure. I mean that's part of I think that the fun of this week is dissecting the matchup. But I mean, like you said it, but before we hit the record button, like you have so much time to dissect a Super Bowl match. It's the biggest game of the year, first of all, but you have an extra week to dig into, which is why I spent a lot of my time, this week trying to get into player stories and things of that sort, just because it's information overload on the matchup aspect of it this week.
Not only that, but like we've been covering these teams for several weeks in a row now, very specifically for these playoffs. So I probably won't even share StatsHub up on the screen as often as I usually do, because hopefully at this point, like we're all quite familiar. So I think, Sam, what I'd really like to do on this show is just talk through like what is the coaching chess match here, because I think in NBA postseason, one of my favorite like aspects of it is you get this, like you get game one, and then game two is all about the adjustments to game one, and then game three is the adjustments to the adjustments, and so on and so forth for the entire series. But with NFL, like that all gets compacted into just one game. And part of that is, the coaches are thinking, okay, how are they going to try to attack us or defend us? And what is our counter? And if they do this, how are we going to counter it? And if they do this, how are we going to counter it? So there are very specific, interesting aspects of this matchup on both sides of the ball that I really like to get into. Is there anything that stands out to you? Actually, you know what? Where we can start is the first time I reached out to you was to ask you if there was anything that you could point to about this Kansas City defense that changed from the beginning of the season to the latter part of the season that suddenly made them a little bit vulnerable to deep passes. And I loved the answer that you gave me. So I think we've been chatting pretty much ever since about football stuff. Can you kind of rehash that whole discussion for the people here?
Yeah, I mean it was twofold, right? I mean, first of all, they did lose Jalen Watson, a cornerback, who was I totally believe that defense is a weak link system, and so I think a lot of teams found the weak link in the Chiefs' defense once Jalen Watson was out. But the other thing is the questions we continue to ask in press conferences to Steve Spagnuolo was, what's going on with the tight ends? I mean, when you looked at their DVOA, they had allowed the tight ends on your guys' website through the first month. It was drastically worse. It wasn't even close to 31st. It was so far in 32nd. And so I think they overcompensated for wanting to put more attention on the tight ends, knowing it was a weak spot for them. And look, credit to them for doing something about it, because they became a lot better at guarding the tight ends. But it made him more susceptible to the explosive play rate. And it was never more obvious than if you go to that Black Friday game, and I can't think off the top of my head what exact week that was, but they gave up like 8 explosive passes to the Raiders in that game. Not a team that was exactly known for its explosive play rate over the year.
To your point here on the DVOA adjusted fantasy points against data, Kansas City on the season finished as the 5th most favorable matchup for opposing tight ends, but they were like plus 54% through 6 weeks or something. Like it was some massive number. In the postseason, Kansas City has done a pretty good job of preventing those explosive plays. Do you think it's just because Watson came back, or do you think that, like, particularly with Houston and the fact that you kind of knew if Houston was going to do anything offensively, it had to be through Nico Collins, that they just had like a very easy answer in that game to really sell out to stop the explosives? What's your thought on now that we're here at the postseason? Are they still the vulnerable second half Kansas City defense, or are they more kind of back to the original?
Well, I think you nailed it with Nico Collins. I mean, that Texans matchup looked different for him in Week 16 when Tank Dell was part of the Texans lineup. And so once he was out, I mean, the Chiefs could shift so much attention to Nico Collins, and the Texans other receivers just weren't good enough to get open with the time that the offensive line allowed them to get open. So that completely changed the complexion of that matchup. I really think that Steve Spagnuolo saved a lot of stuff that he hadn't put on tape for that Bills game.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me wonder what he's got left on tape that he still hasn't shown on tape for this Eagles game, because these are, I think, on the face of it, you would look at Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen and say, okay, they're two different quarterbacks. But there's some similarities with the way the Eagles and Bills like to run offense. I think people anticipate that the Bills are this pass-first team, and they weren't this year. I mean, the Eagles have the highest run rate in the league, but I think the Bills finished like 5th or 6th in the league. So there's a little bit of similarity in that sense for, okay, how much do you want to protect against, giving up big chunk plays against the run, to where Steve Spagnuolo probably does have some carryover from what he saw against the Bills versus what he's going to show against the Eagles.
This is kind of a perfect segue to the first aspect of the chess match, if you will, that I want to talk through. And that is the fact that Kansas City plays a ton of too high. They are outstanding when they play too high. When they have to play single high, that's when they've been vulnerable, and particularly vulnerable to explosive plays. We mentioned this last week in the kind of breakdown of the Buffalo matchup, where Buffalo had faced either the highest or the second highest, like 66% single high on the season, just this huge, massive number. And so much of that game was very clearly going to come down to when Kansas City has to play single high against Buffalo, can they take advantage of explosives? So kind of a two-part question for you here. Number one, Buffalo was not able to take advantage of those single high looks at all. I think they posted something like 3.8 yards per play against single high last week, some real bad number.
Wow.
Do you think Philly will be able to take advantage of the single high looks? And do you think Philly can get Kansas City into those single high looks, because Jalen Hurts has been much better against single high than too high? A.J. Brown, Dallas Goedert, significantly better against single high than too high. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think the one thing that stands out to me about the last 2 times the Chiefs have played the Eagles, which to me is still relevant because you have this, even though you've got a different running back, you've got the same number 1 and 2 wide receivers and the same quarterback. And Devonta Smith was actually the guy that tore them up with explosive plays. And his speed is certainly going to be an issue for the Chiefs. And so I wonder if they're going to give enough attention to those other guys to where if they're playing single high, that's why. It's because they've said, okay, they're taking away A.J. Brown. I've mentioned the issues that we both have that they've had guarding tight ends this year. So it's not like they can abandon that game plan. Mm-hmm. And so then is Devonta Smith the guy you have to try and take your chances with one-on-one? And that's where the explosive rate play could potentially happen. That was actually, when I researched this matchup, I think that was maybe the stat that surprised me the most, is that the Eagles were so high in explosive play rate this year. I think you had them at 13th. And I expected them to be lower just because their passing game has not been as good this year as it was the last couple of years. And I thought maybe that was the reason why, is because they weren't getting the big chunk plays. So I was a little surprised to see that they still are. And I certainly think I anticipate that the Eagles will be taking some shots with Devonta Smith against the Chiefs.
I think part of that too is until the playoffs, the Eagles didn't have A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, and Dallas Goedert healthy all at the same time. Yeah. And that's kind of the theme of this Eagles offense is pick your poison. We're going to have an answer for you, because in the passing game, if you take away A.J. Brown and Dallas Goedert, you still have to worry about Devonta Smith. Then there's the obvious, the pass versus the run. If you take away the pass, they have the run. But even in the running game, if you sell out to stop Saquon Barkley, think of that 40-plus yard touchdown run for Jalen Hurts. The whole defense went with Saquon. Hurts kept it. Jordan Mailata at lead blocker didn't even have anyone to block as Hurts went 40 yards for the score. So,
yeah, but let me ask you something about that, Alex, because there's another number that surprised me. I looked up the Eagles, which is that Saquon Barkley does not face a lot of stacked boxes this year. And I assume part of that is because he's so good outside the tackles. I mean, he's got over 1,000 yards just running outside the tackles this year. But I know you've watched a lot more of the Eagles than I have this year. I mean, why do you think that so many teams have been afraid just to go all out and stop trying to stop the running with the Eagles this year?
I think it's twofold. Number one, it's A.J. Brown. So, if you look at the Eagles last season, everyone knows how they collapsed in the second half of the year, right? remember in the first half of the season when AJ Brown had that like historic run of 140-yard games or something like that, maybe it was 120, 100-yard, whatever the number. AJ Brown was torching teams early in the season for like maybe the first 10 weeks or so. The big adjustment defenses made to the Eagles offense was they stopped giving them single high looks for AJ Brown. A safety was over the top all the time. There was a lot of too high. And so I think the first thing is just teams still realize like, hey, the obvious answer last year was just take away the explosive plays to AJ Brown. I think they still want to try and do that as much as possible. So that's number one. But then number two, Dan Orlovsky was talking about this a couple of weeks ago. Like he's never seen a team that viewed stacked boxes as an opportunity for explosive runs the way Philadelphia does. Saquon keeps ripping off these chunks against stacked boxes. He's got, I was looking at this earlier. He's got, I think, 3 explosive runs against stacked boxes in the postseason alone. That's more than all but 5 running backs had in the entire regular season. It's just, it's unbelievable. And Saquon actually had a quote where he said something along the lines of, when I see stacked boxes, I just get excited because I know if we get this blocked correctly and like Jeff Stoutland plus this offensive line, you're going to get a lot of runs blocked correctly. There's nobody back there. I'm gone. And so I think that's part of it too, is like teams are actually afraid to stack the box too much because you might be able to stop a play here or there, get some 0-yard runs, -1-yard runs, but it's only a matter of time before you give up the 60-yarder. So I think this is actually a great discussion because no defense this season has been better at taking away both the run and the explosive runs when stacking the box than Kansas City. So do you think that Kansas City is going to say to hell with what Washington and LA tried to do? We are going to stack the box on a consistent basis and try to take away the explosives that way.
Yeah, I don't think they're going to leave AJ Brown singled on the outside, but I do think they're going to put as much attention to Saquon Barkley as they can. And one of the advantages they have is that their secondary tackles pretty well. Now, Shamari Connor hasn't tackled well, and he plays a lot of snaps in the slot, but he played a lot of those snaps when Jalen Watson was out. He still gets some snaps. It's just not at the same rate. But Justin Reed tackles well, Trent McDuffie tackles well, Jalen Watson tackles pretty well, and Brian Cook tackles pretty well. So they've got some guys in the secondary that I think they feel like if they get matched up with Saquon Barkley, have a better chance, not a perfect chance, but at least a better chance than some of these teams that you've seen them. I mean, look, Saquon Barkley is terrific. That was a really poor tackling effort from Washington from the onset of that game. And it changed the environment of that game off of the first Eagles offensive snap that they had, to where I think Washington then is playing on its heels, especially in the run defense for the rest of the game. The Chiefs are very much a team that likes to play downhill when they defend the run. It was their point of emphasis in the offseason. Those numbers you mentioned about them being against the run, if you compare them to 2023, they'd be drastically different. Like this was a team that was not good against the run for the past 2 or 3 years. And then, like I said, point of emphasis in the offseason, and that they put a lot of effort into becoming better in that area.
I think you're completely right, which brings me to my first pick of the show here, which is I expect, like you do, that they're not going to give AJ Brown a ton of looks, a ton of one-on-one opportunities, a ton of single high looks. And I think they are going to sell out to stop Saquon. So I think one of the counters for Philly is you fake it to Saquon, Jalen Hurts keeps the ball going the other way, kind of like that run against Los Angeles. So one of the first things that I've been looking at all week is over the 12.5 longest rush for Jalen Hurts and over 19.5 longest rush for Jalen Hurts, which is up to like 2.33x over on Underdog. Use promo code FTN if you haven't signed up yet for Underdog. They're running like 59% profit boosts all week long, by the way, for Super Bowl 59. So really good stuff there. Next,
Alex, look at, sorry to interrupt, but look at just the last Super Bowl that these teams played. I mean, Jalen Hurts with his legs. I mean, he had 3.5 times as many yards as any of the running backs did. Like that was the Eagles' game plan because it was the game plan that the Chiefs forced them into, and it worked pretty well. Like they were content to say, okay, we'll allow Jalen Hurts to run the ball here if that's what you want us to do.
And that's when they didn't have Saquon Barkley too. So
exactly,
it really could be a big game for Jalen Hurts. The only thing I will mention there is like I'm more into the longest rush than I am the total yards, because one of the things we saw from this Philly offense last game was a very clear emphasis on quicker dropbacks, getting the ball out, and the way Tom Brady says it was, get the ball out on time, those rhythm throws. And because he was trying to get rid of the ball quickly, because they had fewer long developing downfield routes, Jalen Hurts didn't scramble at all last game. And so I think we could see a similar thing this game, especially with the threat of the Spagnuolo blitzes, which is what I want to talk about next, where maybe we don't see those scrambles and it's more about the relying on the designed runs for Hurts, which is why I like the longest rush more than the total yards. Any thoughts there?
No, I mean, I think you summed it up well. I mean, the Chiefs have been like we talked about at the onset, that like they've been susceptible to the explosive plays, and it's different from the way Spags started here 4 or 5 years ago, to where they sort of developed this bend but don't break identity, which I've always thought was just synonymous with you don't have a good defense.
Yeah.
And once you become a good defense, you're willing to say, okay, if you beat us over the top, we think that's a rarity and we'll take our chances.
That bend but don't break philosophy, by the way, that was like Jonathan Gannon to the max this last Philadelphia Kansas City matchup. So yeah, as an Eagles fan, I'm much happier with Vic Fangio than I was there with Gannon. Gannon's defenses continue to like dominate the bad teams and the bad quarterbacks, and then they just get shredded by good quarterbacks. So wasn't too surprising to see what happened last Super Bowl. All right, let's talk about this blitz stuff, because I think to me, like, this might be the most fascinating part of the matchup. So couple numbers here. Philadelphia was blitzed the most in the NFL. And usually when you see a team blitz that often, the reason is that they don't handle the blitz well. But Jalen Hurts was 13th in DVOA against the blitz this season. So what is the actual explanation? To me, the explanation is no quarterback, at least potentially no quarterback, had more severe splits when pressured versus when not pressured than Jalen Hurts. We're talking about a top 5 quarterback by DVOA when he's not pressured, and like a bottom 10, bottom 5 quarterback when pressured. The issue for opponents is it's a dominant offensive line. And so even as they've been blitzed more than any other team in the league, they still have the 3rd highest average time to pressure. So how do you expect Spagnuolo to kind of attack this? Because the answer for most teams has been, we have to blitz just to have any hope of getting pressure.
Yeah, I mean, I always look at, they ran into something similar with the Bills last week, to where the Bills have a really good offensive line. Josh Allen, I think, had like 115 passer rating against the blitz. And so everything in the book said, do not blitz this guy. Spagnuolo still came with all sorts of pressure, and it disrupted Josh Allen the whole game. And I think what's different about Spags, it's not about how many blitzes, it's about how can you fool the quarterback and to where it's coming from. And so, look, I expect all sorts of that. I still expect him to blitz frequently in the game. And by the way, I used the Hurts pressure stat on a podcast that I'm on Tuesdays and Fridays last night. And he's the worst DVOA quarterback in the league among the guys that have played at least 10 games this year when he's pressured. And so, like, everything about it says you've got to pressure this guy, but then maybe the blitz isn't the way to do it. And so it tells me that a lot of his pressure is self-inflicted, to where he's holding onto the ball just far too long. And at times he's just got to get rid of the ball. I mean, he just has to make a decision, even if that decision is a throwaway, to where he's just got to get rid of the ball.
I think, like, part of the theme here is we're trying to tell the story about what happened, not just what, but why. And I think part of the story here for Hurts is that he started the season with this like weird turnover bug that he had never experienced in his career before. And now you can clearly see like a very risk-averse quarterback where he's saying, look, I'm going to take an 8-yard sack instead of throwing a pick. And I think moving forward, like, he's going to have to grow out of that a little bit and progress from that. But he's also winning like every single game right now. So you can't argue it too much. And he's also been like forthcoming, saying like, look, my strategy as the quarterback, my job changes based on the opponent and on the game environment. And so I think the only play that I can really point to and say, no, that was like clearly wrong and clearly not the explanation for why you took that sack, was the safety that he took in that Rams game. So for the most part, like, I've got absolutely no complaints with him. I think he's been awesome. And just the threat of what he provides with his legs too. I think this is something I've actually talked about a decent amount this season with Lamar Jackson and even Josh Allen to a degree, but like, I think you'd probably agree with this. I don't think enough people, when they talk about these mobile quarterbacks, mention how much easier the job of quarterback is when the opponent has to consider your legs. It makes the run game better. Tampa Bay was using 2 spies at once against Jaden Daniels. Do you think those 2 guys wouldn't be valuable either as a blitzer or dropping back in coverage?
Yeah, and look, I mean, I actually talk about this a lot from the Chiefs' perspective because I think the most underrated, under talked about aspect of Patrick Mahomes' games is his scrambles. And
Yes.
look, the Chiefs ran their second design run in the Patrick Mahomes era, so they don't ask him to run the ball a lot. Everything he does is on a volunteer basis. But when you look up his EPA per carry, he was better than Jalen Hurts was this year. Like that's how good he is with the scramble, and he's significantly more willing to do it in the postseason because he's more just willing to put his body on the line. And I mean, there's pretty simple logic there. He doesn't think he can make it through a 17-game season playing that way, but once it's the playoffs and it's win or go home. And so I've long thought during these 2 weeks, like, how do the Eagles account for that aspect of his game? Because it was a major part of the Chiefs' game plan a week ago against the Bills.
Yeah, definitely. I think part of that too is not just a willingness to take off more, but when you get to the postseason, you get defenses that are better at rushing the passer. And so he knows, like, I'm not going to be able to sit back here the way I can sometimes in the regular season. And so he's like immediately looking for those escape lanes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, look, Houston fit that to a T. And I think you had mentioned this in like week 17 or 18, or maybe it was going into the postseason, that as good as Houston was defensively, their real weak spot was quarterback scrambles. And in week 16, that's how Patrick Mahomes beat him, is with his legs. It was his first touchdown of the game. He beat him consistently by scrambling. And then they weren't design runs. It was just when you've got guys that have a lot of sacks all year that are used to teeing off on the quarterback, I think they're seeing red in that situation. And then all of a sudden the quarterback gets loose. And that's why I wonder if the Eagles potentially do feel like they need an extra body to account for it.
Yeah, they're so disciplined in the way that they rush the passer, but like we saw Jaden Daniels busted off a long one at the end of the half. So I don't know how they'll approach that, but the scramble conversation brings a question to my mind in relation to one of either my favorite picks of the week or one that maybe I should be a little bit more cautious about. So I want to ask you about Samaje Perine's receiving yards, listed at 7.5 right now. I got it initially at 6.5, but with Mahomes more likely to scramble at this time of season, do you think that helps explain the fact that he only has the one target in the postseason after going over this number in, like, I think it's 14 of 17 games or something like that this year?
I think probably one of the better explanations is just that they led a lot in the Houston game. And look, I mean, Samaje Perine has a very niche role. I mean, he's got a third down role, and it's most likely third and long because their best answer this year on third and short plays has been running the ball. And Kareem Hunt is one of the best running backs in the league on 3rd and 3 or shorter. And they've actually done it. Like, they've long had success running the ball behind the interior of their offensive line, but it's not been Andy Reid's preference to do that, even on 3rd and short. This year it has been. And so that's forced them into, not using him as much as I think. I mean, look, a lot of Kansas City Chiefs fans have wanted them to use Perine more because on a per carry basis, Kareem Hunt and Isaiah Pacheco have not been great for a while now. And so I get that. But, from I know you're asking about the receiving. When you look at the rushing, I don't think Perine has faced a stacked box all year on his rushes. I think literally zero. It's like his numbers are going to be inflated there. And I think in the receiving game, it has been an aspect of there was a play against I can't remember whether it was against the Texans or the Bills. I think it was against the Bills where Perine was open on a third down play and Mahomes just ran it because he decided at that point, let me take the sure thing here. I think he's less willing to take that sort of chance. And, he said something funny after the last game, and this was in relation to the defense, but I think it's applicable here, that he's nervous when he doesn't have the ball. So he's nervous. He's got confidence in the defense, but he's nervous when he doesn't have the ball. I think that also applies to him saying, if I can get this with my legs and I know how this is going to turn out. So why don't I just do that?
100%. I think another explanation for like the lower involvement, if you will, for Perine is their success rate has just been through the roof this postseason, right? And so when is Perine going to be on the field? 2nd and long, 3rd and medium or long. They haven't faced either of those situations very often because they're just ripping off 5-6 yards at a time.
Yeah, I mean, it was what 54.5% success rate against the Bills. So you're exactly right. And I think that's a great point. I mean, when your offense is constantly on schedule, you're not plugging in the running back that is in those situations where your
Yeah.
offense has been tilted off schedule for the first couple of downs.
Yeah, and to that point, Philadelphia, as good as they are, should at least theoretically be able to get Mahomes into more of those situations. All right, let's see. Next question I have for you. The Kansas City wide receiver rotation frustrates a lot of us
Yeah,
DFS players, sports bettors.
I
I,
bet.
I, I've got a theory here, Sam. I think I'm going to focus on DeAndre Hopkins for a second. I think the reason why he hasn't been very involved and not even as in not even on the field, we're not just talking about not getting targets. But the reason he hasn't even been on the field, my thought is a lot of the time it's Worthy, Kelsey, and wide receivers that they want to block. Like the guys who are running routes aren't running routes. They're running to go block the defensive backs as Worthy gets the quick reception or as Travis Kelsey gets the quick reception. Am I onto something there?
Yeah, but I think I think it's more the later part of your point there, which is the Chiefs' offense turned around in Week 16 against the Texans, and the main reason it did, I mean, this coincided with Hollywood Brown, coming
Yeah.
back, but they decided they needed to throw quick. Once they plugged Joe Tooney at left tackle, it became more conscious in their mind that you can't have these 5 to 7 step dropbacks. You have to get rid of the ball quickly. And that's not DeAndre Hopkins' game. I mean, he's a guy that's going to have contested catches. But there's one other thing I think is interesting to look at with DeAndre Hopkins' conversation is he's like dead last in yards after catch per reception this year, dead last in that stat. And Buffalo gave up a lot of yards after catch per reception this year, especially late in the year. And so I don't know if I'm giving the Chiefs too much credit here by saying, okay, that's a weakness for Buffalo. You throw the ball short. He's not the guy that's going to get a lot of yardage after catch. So maybe go with Hollywood Brown, who does. And Juju Smith-Schuster, as unproductive as he is in certain games, he was really good after the catch this year. And he also operated over the middle of the field, where Buffalo was also really weak this year, defending the middle of I think their DVOA middle of the field was like 5th worst in the league or something. So I think matchup-wise, it made a lot of sense for Juju Smith-Schuster to play that game over DeAndre Hopkins. But like I said, I think there's a chance I'm giving them too much credit, and because the Chiefs often just go with the guys that they like, that fit their game plan, worrying less about the opposition. And in that case, I think it's more of just once they rotated this quick passing game, DeAndre Hopkins' place, was more of an odd fit. And look, I mean, DeAndre Hopkins' fit in this offense was bizarre from the get-go.
Yeah.
I mean, Patrick Mahomes is actually like the least aggressive quarterback in the NFL when in terms of throwing into tight windows and that sort of thing. You have to be willing to throw into tight windows if you're going to throw to DeAndre Hopkins. I mean, he's a contested catch wide receiver. So this was an odd fit from the get-go, but it just very much, they had a very strong need at the time when they made that deal.
That last point's a perfect segue into the next thing I want to talk about, which is the fact that Mahomes' average depth of target is tiny in the postseason too. Right, the only guy who's lower is Teddy Bridgewater. He's only thrown the ball once, so it's a very clear, as you said, like risk averse strategy, but it's also kind of just playing to their strengths, getting the ball in the hands of these guys who can do stuff after the catch. So I agree. Like I think it's just kind of a tough spot for Hopkins. However, there hasn't been a better defense at preventing explosive plays, but also preventing yards after the catch than Philadelphia. They tackle so well. So do you think that Kansas City is going to be able to have success offensively with this exact same approach?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Chiefs' yardage after the catch is a little different than most teams. I think a lot of teams get their yardage after the catch by these big receivers who could break tackles, and the Chiefs is very much just schematic.
Yep.
Like they try and scheme guys open and get them into space, and it's their fastest receivers. So I'm not saying that means that Philadelphia is suddenly going to give up yardage after catch in bunches, but I do think it's different, than facing like CeeDee Lamb, and CeeDee Lamb is a better receiver than anyone on the Chiefs roster by a long shot. He just gets his yards after catch in a little bit of a different manner than what the Chiefs do, which is just by. I mean, look, there was I think it was 3 years ago, where McCole Hardman led the league in yards after catch per reception. Well, he was getting the ball 3 yards behind the line of scrimmage on these jet sweep pitch passes all the time. That's one of the reasons that the Chiefs' numbers are really inflated. in this category is because of just exactly what you mentioned at the top, just how short that they throw the ball.
So the fact that they throw the ball this short and just like their overall style of play has me loving the no on Patrick Mahomes' interception. He's only thrown one pick in his last 9 postseason games. I don't know why that's close to 50-50. Also, the under 21.5 for the longest reception for Xavier Worthy. Any thoughts on those two?
Well, I mean, I would encourage people to look at Xavier Worthy's deep numbers this year. I mean, he only caught 3 passes that were air yards above 20. And I know this is different, but it's very much related. Only 3 times did he catch a pass all season that was above 20 yards. Only 3 others did he catch a pass that was 10 yards downfield.
Yeah.
So only 6 of his catches all year were 10 yards downfield or deeper. Like all of his, he came in to fix their deep passing game. That was one of the main reasons that they drafted him. Instead, they just plugged him right into the short passing game in the second half of the season, and he's flourished in that role. That's the reason we've seen him be a lot more productive. The caveat here is he has caught 2 of these in the postseason. One was a contested catch against Houston that was a great play. The other one, I think there's a lot of luck involved in the play he had against the Bills where he ends up coming down with it. Like, you shouldn't bet on that being repeated, right? Like, I think that's going to be an outlier. But yeah, I mean, Xavier Worthy's their short passing game guy more than anybody right now. I mean, they're not running him just wind sprints down the field the way they did MVS in the past couple of postseasons.
Yeah, under this number in 14 of 18 games, by the way, and as we talked about, like the average at the target has even gone down here in the postseason. Last thing I want to talk about with this Kansas City offense, Mina Kimes on her show, I think, did a phenomenal job with Dominic Foxworth last week, talking through the way Kansas City attacked Buffalo. And we mentioned Juju Smith-Schuster and like how he fit that game plan. She talked about the fact that Buffalo loves to play zone, and Kansas City wanted to get them out of zone and into man coverage because they love the matchup against man. And so the way that they did that was with a lot of RPOs. And part of that was Kareem Hunt just getting chunk after chunk, not 15-yard runs, but 5, 6, 8, 4. Like, as we talked about, high success rate, not explosive plays from this Kansas City offense. But then once they were doing that and you run an RPO and the linebackers crash, now you've got Juju Smith-Schuster over the middle, which is why Juju had 60 yards on 2 receptions. What do you think Kansas City wants to do against Philadelphia?
Well, I think what's so interesting about the Chiefs in the playoffs is it's becoming very difficult to predict how teams are going to play against them, because what the Chiefs have been able to do is get teams out of their comfort zone, get teams out of their strength. Last year when the Chiefs won an AFC championship game, all anyone talked about was, why did the Ravens abandon the run? Why did they stop, doing what they do best? The reason that they were the number 1 seed, the reason they were historically good in DVOA was their ability to run the ball. They don't run the ball that much against the Chiefs in the AFC Championship because the Chiefs had a really good defense. And they said, let's throw them off guard here. The same thing happens in the AFC Championship game with the Bills, is the Bills get out of their comfort zone defensively and offensively. And so it's become really difficult to predict, like, are the Eagles going to do what they do best? Or do they feel like, the Chiefs are this behemoth, this unstoppable force to where you've got to do something that they're not expecting? And Vic Fangio has been a master at that over the years against Patrick Mahomes. I know he's 0-8 against Patrick Mahomes, but I would encourage people to look at a game by game, just what his defenses have done against Patrick Mahomes, because his numbers are not as good against Fangio defenses as they are against everyone else.
Yeah, I actually, I can't remember who just wrote about that, but I think it was someone from FCN who wrote about that. Like, but the Kansas City offense had like 16, 17, 15 points in those games. So I love that point. I also think, to that point as well, Philadelphia is as prepared as any to kind of go, quote unquote, out of their comfort zone. Because, for example, they play a ton of single high. They're also number 2 in DVOA when playing 2 high defenses. They rarely blitz. They're number 1 in DVOA when they blitz. So it's weird how good they are already out of their comfort zone. I expect them to play a lot of 2 high because of Mahomes splits, where he just crushes single high. And he's been like 20th or something in DVOA against 2 high this year.
Yeah, and I mean, look, it's been since literally his first game in the NFL. The adage has been "Don't blitz Patrick Mahomes," and for like 4 weeks that first year that he started, everyone was trying to blitz him, and he just tore it up. And ever since then, people have followed the adage to not blitz Patrick Mahomes. And this gets into a really interesting element for me in this game is that when you look at like the Eagles, for example, I think they have faced some different types of defenses in this postseason.
Mhm.
When you look at the Chiefs, like the Bills and Eagles have a lot of similarities stylistically. They have different players. I think the Eagles have a lot more talent. They don't have obvious weak links on their defense, but they don't blitz much. They like to put a lot of guys in coverage. And historically, the few times where Patrick Mahomes has lost in the postseason or the games where he struggled, because you look at the Super Bowl, he's struggled for the first 3 quarters in every game that he's played in the Super Bowl. And in that sense, it's all been teams that can pressure with just the 4 guys without
Yeah.
bringing extra numbers. They can beat up on the Chiefs offensive line just by rushing their front 4. And so to me, if I'm the Eagles, my game plan is all based on, can Jalen Carter win? Can the 4 guys up front win so I don't have to bring extra guys?
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't possibly agree more. It also makes me very excited about the rumor mills are swirling that maybe Myles Garrett is going to be an Eagle as well. And it won't be fun for opponents to have the game plan for Jalen Carter and Myles Garrett. I'll tell you that much. But I guess my last football related question for you for the Super Bowl here is, how do you think Kansas City's offensive line is going to perform? And what do you think their strategy protection wise is going to be? Because it sure seems like weaknesses are out wide, but you've got to pay the most attention to Jalen Carter. Should we expect a big game from Josh Sweat and Nolan Smith on the outside?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's happened since about week 16 is defensive ends, starting with TJ Watt, have been really frustrated to play against the Chiefs, not because they're not winning, but because they are winning and the ball's already out of Patrick Mahomes' hands. And so I think that those are favorable matchups for the Eagles,
Mhm.
but the Chiefs' whole chemistry has been not, letting their worst matchups lose them
Yep.
offensive success rate. And they've been terrific at it. And so I think the Eagles have to figure out a way to make their defensive line a factor. And I don't know that that's, stronger press coverage. You probably know better than I do how good the Eagles have been with press coverage this year, but that we've yet to see a team, and the Chiefs haven't put this on film for that long
Mhm.
this year. It was
Yep.
just week 6. I mean, how many teams get one of their best receivers to make a season debut on week 16 to where there wasn't a lot of film for these teams
Yeah.
to look at to say this is when the Chiefs offense is best. But we've got 2 games to look at. Like that's it. That's all that the Chiefs had out there.
And that's kind of what they love to do, right? Like they know we don't need to show everything in the regular season. Then you add in the fact that like they're healthier now than they had been, and it just really plays into their hands even more. I think for me, one of the things that I want to kind of drill home for people about this matchup is throughout most of the season on this show, we've kind of tried to talk about like, hey, here's the matchup, here's the way it's going to play out. They're going to attack this way. Here's who benefits. To me, this game is way too unpredictable for that type of analysis. You have 3 of like the best football minds in football in this game: Andy Reid, Vic Fangio, Spagnuolo. Not only are they really good football minds, but they're also very unpredictable in the way that they're going to
Yeah,
attack. And so
that's a
I
great
think,
point, Alex.
yeah,
Yeah.
I really want to caution people, like whether you're building a showdown lineup or trying to tie props together or same game parlays, like make sure you're telling a story of, you don't need to guess exactly what's going to happen, but you kind of know, like, hey, if they attack this way, here's what's going to happen. If they attack this way, here's what's going to happen. You can do a bunch of different things, but make sure you're telling a story in whatever you're doing. Because if we sit here trying to act like we know what Spagnuolo and Fangio and Andy Reid are going to do,
Yeah.
we're fools, because NFL coaches don't know what these guys are going to do.
Yeah, and I mean, look, it's the reason they're here, right?
Mhm.
But another aspect of that is when I was going through trying to guess how Steve Spagnuolo might defend this defense, every potential quote unquote solution that you have to follow with the yeah, but what about this?
Yeah.
And it makes you realize why the Eagles have a good offense, and it makes you
Mhm.
realize when you do the inverse why the Chiefs even though their offensive numbers aren't what they had been, why they still have a high success rate. And it makes you realize why the Eagles have a good defense. I think most teams, and most teams did this early in the year, would say they've got rookie cornerbacks playing. Like, those are the guys we're going to pick on. Well, the rookie cornerbacks are really good, as it turns out. Like, they don't have weaknesses on their defense. And so, that's exactly why, even as much as it's the people themselves that you mentioned, it's also who they're going against that makes them unpredictable.
Yeah. I think the last thing for me here is, like, as far as predictions go, it's going to surprise no one that I'm going to predict an Eagles victory here. On paper, I just think better than any other team, any other potential opponent for Kansas City, the Eagles always have an answer. We talked about, like, how many different ways they can attack you offensively, and how many, like, whether it's AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, or it's throw versus run, or it's Hurts versus Barkley in the run game, they always have an answer. And I think that the same thing exists on the defensive side. But the scary thing is, it's Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. So Kansas City's always in it. How about a prediction from yourself?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think this is a coin toss game. And I think when you look at the matchup, that the Eagles are stronger almost everywhere than the Chiefs, other than the position that it matters most. I mean, you definitely want to have Patrick Mahomes going into this game. You take the Eagles defense, I think. You take their offensive line. You take their wide receivers. I mean, you take the Eagles almost everywhere else, except I also take Steve Spagnuolo to potentially fool Jalen Hurts a couple of times. So I look, to be totally candid, at one point I was going to pick the Eagles to win this game. But if I think it's a coin flip game, I mean, the Chiefs season has been coin flip, and they predicted every one of them right. And so I think if you think it's a coin flip game, you got to go with the team that seems to have mastered picking coin tosses right. So I've got the Chiefs 24-23 in the game.
I like that a lot. I almost think that if the Eagles win, they win by a touchdown or more, and not they squeak out a 2-point win when it's coming down to the last possession or something like that. Sam, I appreciate you hopping on so much. It's been an absolute blast talking through this game. I know you've had a crazy busy week. Good luck to you and the Chiefs this week, but I know that our viewers here are going to really like your analysis. So where can they consistently find all of your insights?
Yeah, it's I'm at kansascity.com. So, I mean, it's a pretty easy website. Luckily, we must have gobbled that up in like the 90s or something. So yeah, kansascity.com, you scroll down the columns and you can find my name there. So, but I super appreciate you having me on, Alex. You know this, but the viewers don't. I first connected with you because I've been an FTN subscriber for a really long time. And what drew me to you was I didn't know what was on FTN's website. It seemed like every time it was on there, I found something new. And watching you scroll from stat to stat on there, I told you this off air, but like I would, I listen to podcasts at an accelerated rate. Anytime you pulled up the screen of the StatsHub, I'd have to pause it and be like, okay, how do you get from here to here to here? And finding the wealth of information. I'm telling you, every time, I watch you, I find out there's some other stat that's out there. And I look at how it relates to the team that I cover, and I find something interesting to share with readers. So I really love what you do, and I appreciate you having me on too.
That's fantastic to hear. Really appreciate those kind words. Thanks once again, Sam. I got to do this to you. Go Birds.